we've got quite a treat for you this evening, actually, because we've got a very great, to my mind anyhow, a great OD who came to the Dragon, was here sort of during the 60s and 70s. Now, I wonder if any Dragon can tell me who was headmaster of the Dragon during the 1960s and 1970s. Yes, quickly, someone. Yes, please, at the front there. Yes, it was. It was a man called Inky. Very good. Well done. And then later on, Gov became co-head with him. So that was a time which was similar in some ways. The Dragon was very similar in many ways, but of course very different as well. This gentleman who's going to speak, Mr. Simon Tolkien, who you'll see in a moment, was lucky enough to be a Dragon in that time, as you are lucky enough to be Dragons in your time. And then he went on to other schools and did other many things. So he's been a Dragon, which is the first thing to always bear in mind. We're always delighted when our ODs or our present Dragons are on stage here. He's also been a barrister in London, a criminal barrister, so he's had a huge career there. And he's also been a novelist, and he's written at least, I think 5 is the right number, of successful novels already. You may not have read them yet, but many of the people around the edge of the hall, I would suspect, have heard of them and may well have read them as well. So we're very grateful for him to be here. Of course, he can't actually be here physically because, as you can imagine, Mr. Tolkien, Simon Tolkien, is actually over in the States at the moment. So kindly, he's adjusted his work pattern and his day pattern so he's able to zoom into us, hence all this palaver with the computer system here, which is working at the moment absolutely perfectly. He says famous last words. Anyhow, it's working perfectly, so we're on for that. So what's going to happen, boys and girls, is Mr. Tolkien is going to talk for about 30-40 minutes, that sort of length of time as normal. And then at the end of that, there'll be questions, which you can ask, of course. And to help you with those questions and to make sure they're all recorded sensibly, Mr. James and I will come around with the microphones. And you can see how I'm holding this microphone now, which is sort of at 90 degrees to my face and quite close to my mouth, so that Mr. Tolkien can hear it, and indeed everyone in the hall can hear it well as well. So, of course, he's a famous man with a famous pedigree, and he'll talk a little bit about that. You saw the slides beforehand, but just to make sure he knows that he's in the right school and he's not just zoomed into the wrong place by mistake, can we, as always, give Mr. Simon Tolkien a very warm and engaging Dragon School welcome, please. Thank you, boys and girls.
It's a real honor to be here today. I was at the Dragon School. I left the Dragon School 50 years ago this year. So it's a long time, but it's stayed very much in my heart since then. And what I was going to try and tell you about today was a little bit about what the Dragon School was like in my time, a little bit about what the Dragon School was like in my father's time, because both my father and my 2 uncles went to the school back in the 1930s. And in that way, maybe, I know that Ed was just standing underneath the picture of Skipper, but I can tell you a little bit about Hum, and I can tell you a little bit about Gov, who are probably just like pictures on the wall for you, but maybe I can bring them to life a bit. And then I was going to tell you about what I did with my life after I did with the Dragon School, because I think one of the points of this spectrum, these spectrum evenings, is to give that sense of possibility that if we follow if we accept challenges and take them on, and with the talents that we have, really anything is possible. And I think that's what I found in my life, sitting here now in California and talking to you now. Back in the day, I was in the Dragon School. I started in about 1966. And in those days, there was something called the Baby Dragon, which was on the other side of Bardwell Road. And that was what is now, I think, Lynham School, which is down in Richards Lane in Summertown. And as I say, my father had been there and both my uncles had been there. My father died about a few years ago, and he told me one of his big memories of the Dragon School was on Armistice Day, which was just passed in 1935. And Ed was just standing underneath the picture of Skipper. So just down from Skipper is the second headmaster of the Dragon School, Hum, who you can see on the wall. And my father, because he was a Catholic, they didn't go to the morning prayers. Catholics in those days, and they didn't go to the Remembrance Day service that they had on that day. And so on that day, he took his bicycle down that lane which runs parallel to the playing fields and leading to the river. And he found a hole in the hedge. And he looked through the hole in the hedge, and they were holding the Armistice Day service on November the 11th, 1935. And he saw Hum, the headmaster, and he was reading out the names of all the boys who had died in the First World War that you see on that war memorial. And it made, I think my father remembered it so well from his childhood, partly because he'd been excluded from it, looking through the hole in the wall, but partly because he could see how much Hum was moved by all these people who he'd known, who had died so young. So that was a memory that he had. And the other thing I wanted to tell you about is if you jump forward like 6 years, when the Second World War had begun, there was a plane crash in Oxford, in North Oxford. I don't know if any of you know about this, but my aunt told me about it. And it was on a day in May of 1941. And it was a Sunday, and there was beautiful weather. And it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And my father was in the garden with his telescope looking up at the planes, because they had planes that were training over in the sky. And my aunt looked up, and there was a plane that was flying much lower than the others. And it looked like the pictures of planes that had been hit in dogfights. There was a cloud of black smoke and flames coming from its engine. And the next moment, he heard my father saying, "Good God, it's going to crash." And there was a terrible explosion. And she saw that she realized that the plane had gone down. And she ran into the house to her parents, who were obviously very frightened. My father left on his bicycle with my grandfather, J.R.R. Tolkien, to find out what had happened. And when my grandfather came back, he told my aunt that the plane had crashed in the field of a house with big grounds in Linton Road, just a couple of streets away from where you are now. And he said that there'd been a cottage with a thatched roof, and that a boy just of your age had been trapped in an upper room by the fire that had engulfed the cottage as it spread from the burning plane. My father said that the French master at the Dragon School at that time, 1941, Mr. Retty, had rushed out with a hose and ladder, but without any protective clothing, and had climbed up to the top floor and rescued the boy. And he also said that there were a lot of people getting off the buses in the Banbury Road and jamming the side streets, so it made it difficult for the police and firefighters to get through. And the relevance of all this is that afterwards, there was an investigation of the crash, and people learned that the pilot of the plane had made a sharp turn away from the residential houses towards the Dragon School as he came in. And he was obviously intending to crash land his plane in the playing fields of the Dragon School. And it was a Sunday. He'd obviously have had a map, and he would have seen that the fields would have been empty and hoped that it was a Sunday. But the Dragon School, of course, was a boarding school. And so there were children in the fields. And so as he came down intending to crash land the plane, he saw the children and made that sharp turn away, which is why he crash landed in Linton Road. And they thought later that if he had been able to crash land his plane in the Dragon School, that perhaps those couple of seconds would have meant that he and his crew wouldn't have died, because they all died in the explosion. And I think what had happened is that in that last moment, he gave his life to save the lives of the children who were down on the playing fields. So I think it's an extraordinary moment kind of in Dragon history that I only really found out about from my aunt several years ago, and it's extremely vivid in my mind. The pilot's name was Charles Small, and there's a memorial to him and to his crew in Wolfson College just down the road. So I wanted to tell you about that. I obviously didn't witness any plane crashes when I was at the Dragon School, but I did almost die. So I thought it would be interesting to tell you about that. Back in those days, there was no swimming pool. We learned to swim in the river. down at the bottom of the playing fields. And there was these long poles with leather straps coming down off them, which were tied around the bodies of the boys, who were pulled up and down by the masters on jetties, flailing about in the river. And then once you got the hang of that, you graduated to this thing called a bubble, which was tied around your back. And I graduated to the bubble and went out of the middle of the Cherwell, and it burst right in the middle. And I sank down into those murky depths once, twice, and I don't know, about 3 times. And Gov, who, if you look to your, is it your right or your left? Ed will hopefully point him out to you, on the wall next to Inky, was the teacher who jumped into the river and pulled me out, which is the nearest I've ever come to death. And without Gov, I wouldn't be here today, and nor would my children or anyone. And it's all extraordinarily vivid in my mind, lying on the bank, you know, getting my breath back and feeling so scared, and him leaning down over me. And then I don't know whether it was a result of what had happened to me with the bubble, but the next year, the Dragon School built the swimming pool, which I imagine you still have, you know, very state of the art. And I actually learned to swim in the swimming pool, and we had something called the clothes test. I don't know if you still have that, which meant that you had to swim up and down, I think 3 times the length of the pool in your clothes. And I was able to do that, and that had a real sense of triumph for me. So back in the day, I don't know what the Dragon is like now, but I think it's probably the same as in my time, in the sense that it was vivid and vibrant, and it was never dull. And all the masters, I can remember so many of them vividly. In my school I went to after the Dragon, not nearly so much. They were eccentric, but interesting. And they all had nicknames. There was obviously Inky, who was the headmaster, and there was Gov. There were people like Putty and Boggy, who were like, I mean, just names, but just terrible rages. The geography master, Mr. Parnwell, known as Parney, he used the 1970 World Cup 52 years ago to make all the geography of the different countries participating really interesting, I remember. There was a man called Dyser, whose idea on wet Wednesday afternoons was to take us up onto Shotover Hill and make us hunt him. He would hide and we would never find him. And there was Mr. Longrig, who taught chess, and I did the chess, playing that in cold nights up on the top of the Skipper Hall. And Mr. Roberts, who encouraged my love of history. So all that was back in my day. We had marbles, I imagine you still have, which we constructed in mounds on the playground. We had carnations and chinas and bottle tops and spirals. Spirals, I don't know whether that's the case now, maybe now they're cheap, but that back then they were the crown jewels. And I remember once a boy showing me a jumbo spiral, and it seemed to me at the time like the Koh-i-Noor diamond. It was just so extraordinary, an heirloom that had passed through his family. And we listened to the cricket test matches lying on the grass on the summer days down by the First 11 pavilion. Back in those days, the West Indies were dominant. And on Saturday afternoons, we went to where I think now is your science block, which is the new hall. And in those days, and where we did dancing classes, which was the only time us boys actually met girls. And we had to take our partners and waltz around the new hall back in those days. So a little bit about the Dragon, and then back to, you know, what happened to me. I went to a school kind of badly named called Downside, back down in the wilds of Somerset. And from there, I went to Trinity College, Oxford, and I studied history. And when I came out of Oxford, I kind of didn't have a clear vocation about what I wanted to do. And my father thought that I should become a lawyer because a lawyer is a safe thing to be, get a profession. And so I went to law school in London, as you need to do, for 2 years. And I memorized vast amounts of information. I memorized lots of information at the Dragon School, but this was just unbelievable. All these sections of the Companies Act and the revenue acts and land law and contracts. And at the end of that, you have to go and train for 2 years as an article clerk. And I went off to do that. And I did a lot of conveyancing, which is selling and the selling of houses. And I did civil litigation. And I thought it was a real straitjacket. And I didn't like it at all. And I got kind of bored. And so in the last 6 months, I did crime. And that was a real game changer for me. And I suddenly kind of came alive and got really interested, because I think that up until when I was doing crime in London, I'd had a kind of sheltered life. I'd gone to the Dragon School. I'd lived in this little village outside Oxford. I'd been at Oxford University, and it was really doing crime that gave me this sense of the whole world and people living in pretty adverse conditions and all that in London. And I was fascinated, I think, by the kind of sense that I was getting of real life lived in extreme situations. So at night, I qualified as a solicitor, and then I became a criminal solicitor in London. So at night, you would go out to police stations, West End, Central, places like this, to deal with people who'd been arrested for anything from causing a nuisance to committing murders out on the streets during the night. And then in the morning, you'd be something called a duty solicitor, which meant that you would go to, usually I went to Bow Street Magistrates Court, which was the central London Magistrates Court. And you would have to deal with all the people who had not got their own lawyers, who had been brought in or arrested overnight and brought to court. So you would begin by going and seeing the prosecutor and finding out what the charges were against these people, which could be completely varied. And then you'd have to go down into the bowels, down into the depths of Bow Street Magistrates Court, which was really just like it had been back in the Victorian times. And you would, I would look through the cell bars, because they would have like 5 or 6 people to each cell. And the noise was unbelievable, the shouting and all that. And you'd have to try and get instructions, as we called it, from the clients, the people who'd been brought in, the people who'd been arrested, about what they wanted to do about the charges that were against them. Some would want to plead guilty, in which case you'd have to make what was called a plea in mitigation, which means that you would stand up and try and say the things that made the crime less severe than it might look at first sight, so they would get a lesser sentence. Some you'd be waiting for the prosecution to provide evidence. And in those cases, you'd want to make a bail application. I keep saying you, me. And that required organizing people who would stand surety, i.e. guarantee that the person would come back and all this. It was an extremely intense world. And sometimes there would be 10 or 11 people that you deal with in this way, brought up from the cells, one after the other, in front of the magistrates. There's one thing which I really remember from Bow Street, which was an extraordinary moment, is that I was sitting there being the duty solicitor one day, and they brought a judge in to be arraigned. And he was said to have committed a fraud. And I remember just feeling this incredible anger that a judge who should have sentenced people to, you know, prison and stuff should have committed a crime. I know, that's just something I remember. The other part of being a criminal solicitor was that I would go to prisons, you know, Wandsworth, Pentonville, Brixton, and get instructions. By that, I mean long statements from people who were charged with very serious offenses, drug importation, crimes of violence, etc., so that you could prepare their cases for trial. And the trials would be done by barristers in wigs and gowns. And as time went by, I grew frustrated by this. And I didn't want any longer to be the person preparing the trial. I wanted to be the person who was actually presenting it. And so in the middle of the 1990s, I went from being a solicitor to become a barrister, which obviously means it's not just the wig and gown, but you're actually up in the higher courts doing trials. I haven't got a picture of me in the wig and gown, but it's kind of, you wear these really, really tight collars, and you have to put studs in, and you have these wing collars and a wig and a gown. On the first day, I couldn't actually get the studs in and thought I'd made a terrible mistake about actually becoming a barrister, I seem to remember. What I loved about being a barrister, and also I guess what I found so difficult about it because it was so stressful, is that everything kind of depended on you. Everything mattered. The whole outcome of what was going to happen, whether your guy was going to walk out of the courtroom a free man, or whether he was going to go to jail, because in these cases, these were serious cases, so prison was what was going to be involved, depended on decisions that you made. You had to make a decision about whether or not your client should give evidence. How was he going to stand up to cross-examination? You had to make a decision about what questions to ask the prosecution witnesses. All these kind of questions all the time. It's an incredibly intense job because you're there cross-examining a witness who's already made a statement. So you have the statement they have made to the police. So you're comparing that while you're making a note of the evidence that they're giving and seeing if there are any contradictions between one and the other. Then at the same time, you're writing down the questions that you're going to put to them in cross-examination. And then as you ask those questions, you record their answers and you try and remember things where you caught them out or where they've, got weak, so that you can remember those points to make to the jury when you actually make your closing speech. Because if you don't remember them, they're lost. It's not being recorded like we are now. And then this moment at the end of the trial, which is so extraordinary, when you bring together everything you've got to make this closing speech to the jury. So they've sat there all the way through the trial and they say nothing at all. You don't know who they are. And you have to persuade them. You have to make them think that your client might not have committed that offense. You have to give them the possibility of doubt. And then it's over to them. And then this extraordinary tension, because you often with my client, you become very close to them during it, and you know what's at stake and what's at stake for their families, and you wait. And sometimes you have to wait for 2 or 3 days, or not 2 or 3 days, but over to the next day. And sometimes they give a majority direction whereby the jury can reach a verdict with 10 or 11. And finally, you hear, over the tannoy, over the loudspeaker, that, the jury has reached a verdict. Then you come in and there's that moment where everything hangs in the balance. And you're looking up at the royal crest, or I'm looking up at the royal crest above the judge's head. And it could go either way, one way or the other way. Maybe to somebody else it's going to be guilty, but because you put everything you've got into trying to get a not guilty verdict, and then in a moment it's over. It's theater. It's like being an actor and also being a director at the same time. And it's a very adversarial and sometimes quite a scary world. Some of the judges back in my day, back in the 90s, they were pretty scary. And a lot of the conversations in what we call the robing rooms, which is where the barristers hang out, when they're not in court, were about, which judges had been most terrible in Southwark or the Old Bailey or one. I remember one judge who was just really scared me. And I was doing this grievous bodily harm trial, and he really pushed me to the limit. And he was just ice cold, and everything that he said was like undermining me. And it was hard to, get through it. And I felt, that I could lose my nerve. And then the next week, the clerks, because there are clerks in your chambers who are organizing work for you, said that there was a sentencing hearing in front of the same judge. And I thought, I've got to do this, because if I don't go back in front of him, I'll have lost my nerve. So I did. And it was a funny hearing, because it was about 2 ladies who at the time, because Princess Diana had just died, and they had all these flowers that were heaped up in front of Kensington Palace. And these ladies had come and stolen some of the flowers from in front of the palace. And the magistrate down in the first hearing had sentenced them both to 3 months prison because he thought it was such a horrible thing to do. But the judge, the ice cold judge, he let them off, and he let them out because he said it was still stealing flowers, even if the even though the circumstances were for Princess Diana. But it was a strange moment that I got my nerve back just at the same time in relation to her death. So the kind of two are linked in my mind. So I was a barrister through until just under 20 years ago. And then I went from being a barrister to writing novels. And as Ed said, I've written 5. And I've just finished my 6th. I think it's a really strange story. And I think I must have had a really long suppressed desire to write and to create. Because the funny thing about my life is that I was always sure that I couldn't write. I couldn't write fiction. And I thought that because my style was too self-conscious. I was always self-conscious. So I couldn't write direct about what I wanted to say because I could hear my voice saying it. I don't know why I thought this. Certainly I did have a self-consciousness problem. I think in retrospect, you kind of guess about what happened to you in your life using hindsight. And I don't know if this is right, but I think it had a bit to do with, or quite a lot to do with feeling overshadowed by my grandfather, J.R.R. Tolkien, because, you know, if he was able to write these incredible books, how could I begin to do the same? But perhaps, you know, because I never wrote a word of fiction until I was 40 years old. And I only started when I actually started at the millennium. And I think maybe that I'd been unconsciously setting out to do this for a long time because I wrote a diary from all the way through the 90s. And I think what I was doing while I was writing a diary, just saying what was happening in every day, and I wrote like a page a day, was actually trying to find a voice. So I started writing and I wrote this book, which was kind of like a black comedy. And I sent it off to literary agents, which is what you have to do if you want to get yourself published. And I sent them to literary agents in America as well as in London. So I queued up at the post office with what were called international reply coupons. And then I thought that I kind of written a masterpiece, idiot that I was. And, you know, then I waited and slowly, bit by bit, all these replies came back saying, no. And that was kind of it, except one of the agents said, you know, what you need to do is try and write about what you know, which was really good advice because I didn't want to be defeated. I think that's one of the things that's been most important in my life is not wanting to be defeated and carrying on, what I was saying about challenges at the beginning. And so I took that on board. And the first 2 books I wrote were courtroom dramas. In other words, the novels were structured around trials. And these helped me because the language of the courtroom, which is kind of a stilted language, you know, my learned friend and all that kind of stuff, I submit, your honor and all that. It was a language I knew, so I didn't have to worry about self-consciousness. And the trial gave a structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in fact, having been a lawyer really helped because with a lawyer, you have to organize your material. And to write these thrillers, courtroom dramas, you had to have everything really organized in order to make them work. And so I used the trial as, you know, the tension would build towards the verdict and towards the sentence as if the guy is convicted. And in my second novel, which was the Inheritance, there's to explain, to give you an idea of how this works. I had a young man who was falsely accused of murdering his father. And there were 5 others in the house at the time who could plausibly have committed the crime. And my policeman, I came up with a policeman called Inspector Trave, has to find out who did it in a race against time, because this book was set in the 1960s. And I don't know if you know, but back in the 1960s, we still had capital punishment. in this country. And when the guy is convicted, he's sentenced to hang. And in those days, that happened pretty quickly. It wasn't like happens in the States now, where people wait 10, 15 years. You know, it happened within a month. The appeal process was very, very quick. And so my book really has the tension ratcheting up in a really big way, right up to the last moment of whether the policeman can crack the case, find the murderer, and stop the execution taking place. And in fact, in my book, the poor young man, is actually in the place that in purpose built in HM Prison Wandsworth in the 1960s for executions. And little did the young man know that in the back of his wardrobe in his cell is actually, and this is actually true, was a false back, so that the hangman could come through the door, open the door of the wardrobe, grab hold of the guy, this would be Pierpoint, the hangman, and execute the man within like 30 seconds. It was supposed to be an act of mercy, but the whole idea of this whole purpose-built block for execution really, really upset me. And I think that this has also been something that's gone on with my writing, is that I've wanted, you know, I've tried in my writing to deal with things that really I find personally upsetting. The death penalty. I mean, I remember writing an essay about the death penalty at the Dragon School. And in my third book, The King of Diamonds, is about the Holocaust. And my most recent book, No Man's Land, about the, which I'll come on to, which is about the trenches, was about this nightmare that I always had when I was young about being sent away to a terrible war. And we obviously, you know, see that happening now with the poor people in Ukraine. The other thing with The Inheritance, which was my second book that I started, was that it had a historical dimension. In order for Inspector Trave to find out who actually had murdered, who had committed the murder, he has to go back. He had to go back 20 years to World War II and a crime that had been committed in France by the dead man, which was to obtain possession of an ancient religious artifact. So history was beginning to come into my books with the second novel. And in my fourth novel, I actually went back all the way to 1940 and my fourth novel is Orders from Berlin, which is this. It's set in 1940, and I don't know how many of you know much about the Second World War. I hope you know a bit. This was the second year of the war, and it was that moment when the Nazis had conquered France and the British army had been evacuated from Dunkirk. And the Nazis were allied with Italy, they were allied with Russia. America was not in the war, and England stood alone. And in the September of that year, the huge bombing, which we call the Blitz, began in London, the first real saturation bombing of a city in history. And everything depended on the leadership at that time of Winston Churchill. And I'm sure some of you may have heard his speeches or heard talk about them. The famous one says, where he says, "We shall fight them on the beaches, on the landing grounds. We shall fight them in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." And these speeches really gave heart to the British people at a time when they were really at their most, really at the end, really close to defeat. People call this their finest hour. They call it also the darkest hour. There's a movie of that title, which you may have heard of. But I also think it's the most vulnerable hour for England. And I think before the war, again, you may not know this, but before the war, the British government policy towards Hitler and the Nazis had been to avoid war at all costs. And this led to a policy called appeasement. And it led to something called the Munich Conference, whereby we allowed Hitler to walk into Czechoslovakia. And this was because we didn't want a repeat of the First World War. And there was still quite a strong section of Parliament that would have preferred a negotiated peace. I tell you all this because this formed the background, the historical background to my book, because I took the view that at this moment, if Churchill had been removed and had been assassinated, then the Nazis might plausibly have thought that England would have sued for peace. And so my book is about a plot by the Nazis, by Hitler and his subordinates, using a mole, I don't know if you know what that means, but a spy on the inside in the British Secret Service, MI6, to assassinate Churchill. And I took my policeman from The Inheritance book, Inspector Trave, and had him as a much younger man, 20 years earlier. And he investigates a murder, which leads him to stumble on this plot. And he then has to, because nobody believes him, has to thwart it himself. And that leads right up to a scene inside Churchill's study in 10 Downing Street, when he is about to be shot, and Trave saves him. I liked the idea I wanted to construct, and I hope I was able to, the idea that the whole fate of the world could come down to the accident of a moment and one small man at the center of it all. And I loved this way in which I'd become immersed in history in writing the book. Back at the end, back about 30 years ago, the BBC did this wonderful work called The People's History, in which they went around and they interviewed people who had actually experienced bombing. These people were quite old then. It was before they died, so we would have those memories. And I read all of that. And what I wanted to do is, and I wanted to do in my books, is to try and describe what it's like to have experienced these terrible things, what it's like to be bombed. I mean, just like the people in Ukraine are being bombed now. Just one small moment that I could share with you. I came upon a description of a man who, a warden who'd walked out and to a scene of a bombing, and there was just a hand, nothing more than a hand and a wrist sticking out from the rubble. And he couldn't get the man underneath out. He didn't know whether it was a man or woman, old or young, but he could feel that the hand was alive. The person underneath was alive. And so all he could do was just sit there holding the hand until it went cold. And these kind of things made me, I included that in my book, feel that this really happened. And that's what I wanted to convey. I also find it a really interesting challenge in writing Orders from Berlin to try and make these characters alive from real history, Churchill and also Hitler. And there are these extraordinary videos on YouTube, which was shot by Hitler's girlfriend, Eva Braun, using home video cameras that you can see on YouTube. And they've lip synced them, so you can actually see what Hitler is saying. I found that really interesting. From Orders from Berlin, I felt a lot of confidence after that to go in a new direction. So I stopped writing thrillers and I started writing complete historical fiction. So no longer was there a plot which was moving things along. The characters themselves created their own story. And that's what my last book, No Man's Land, about the First World War, is about. I went back to those years leading up to World War I, and I started with a boy who was just about your age, who gets caught up in the struggle between the miners and their employers in Yorkshire. This is the world of Downton Abbey, but it's also the world of the terrifying coal mines as they were then, when there was a constant risk of explosions and roof falls and of being buried alive, as indeed happens. And then when the war breaks out, my hero went to go to the war with his friends to fight in the trenches in France. I understand that none of you have been able to go to the battlefields, but I think this is something hopefully you will be able to do later. I found going there incredibly moving. You know, the silent cemeteries with the white crosses, the bugler playing the last post under the memorial to the missing, the sunken road where the soldiers waited to attack on the first day of the great battle, the Battle of the Somme in the middle of the war. And that battle is the centerpiece of my book, when 20,000 people of British soldiers died, the worst day in the British Army's history. And my book deals with all that and tries to make it real, but it also deals with that whole issue of what it was like to be back home in England, particularly the women who were left behind, and how they were cut off from their men. And this whole situation where my hero can't bear to tell his fiancée what he's endured, and so shuts her out from his experience. And this leading to the end of their, or temporary end of their relationship. I think writing this book made me feel very close to my grandfather, J.R.R. Tolkien, because he fought in this battle, the Somme, in 1916. And the first beginnings of the writing about Middle-earth are written on the back of trench maps and in books that he kept when he was invalided out. So that was what he was thinking of. And I think we see, I don't know how many of you know The Lord of the Rings, but we see the battlefield experience coming over in The Lord of the Rings, particularly in the Dead Marshes, where Gollum and Sam and Frodo have to cross the old battlefield on their way to Mordor, and they see the dead faces in the pools lit by the candles under the water. No Man's Land was published on the centenary of the Somme battle in 2016. And since then, I've been trying to, or I've just finished writing a book about an American. So that's a new start for me, who volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War, which was fought in the 3 years before the World War II, and began when Spanish fascists tried to overthrow the democratically elected government in Spain. A vicious war. And my story goes from New York to England to Spain, and is really a portrait of the entire 1930s. These kind of books, No Man's Land and this book, require a huge amount of research. And I've got to the point now where the research actually takes longer than the writing. So the last book that I've written has taken more than nearly 6 years. No Man's Land took nearly 5. And each of them, the research part of it, reading the primary accounts and all that, has taken over 3 years, or 3 years. It's a huge undertaking. I don't know whether it's something I want to carry on with or not at that level. And for the last nearly 15 years, I've been living with my wife, Tracy, in Santa Barbara in California, where I'm talking to you from now. So it's a strange life, really, to live kind of half in California in this very modern world, and half in the first half of the 20th century, where I've been trying to recreate these vanished worlds. And you can read what the soldiers and the young men and the young women of those days and all the people wrote. You can hear their memories. You can see their photographs, and in some cases, you can actually watch movies with them. But there's still that gossamer, as I think of it, curtain dividing us from the past. And what I try to do through my fiction and now is to try and take readers for a moment through the curtain, if I can. I don't know how successful I am, but that's what I try to do, so that the past, we can enter the past and experience it as it was. So it's been a long journey the last 50 years since I left the Dragon School. And I think I've probably had many pitfalls and many mistakes, but I think I've tried to take on the challenges. I think that's what I've tried to do all the way, and learn. And I think taking on challenges makes us who we are. And I suppose I've tried to make the most of my talents. I hope so. And I've remembered the motto of the Dragon School, arduus ad solem, to strive towards the sun. I think I've tried to do that and continue to do so. Okay, I don't know how long I've gone on. I hope that was 40 minutes. I hope it's not longer than that. But thank you so much for listening and for being so patient.
Simon, that was wonderful, Simon. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, a quick round of applause for Simon now, please. Goodness me, what a treat and what a life he has led. Now, boys and girls, I know you've been really good listening carefully at the end of a long day and a long week. And I know lots of you, as always, will have been thinking, well, I've got just one question I'd like to ask Simon Tolkien, because it's a rare opportunity to see him here. So if you've got that question, you put your hand up in the normal way, and either Mr. James or myself will come over to you with the mic. As I say, if you can hold it pretty much at right angles to your face and have it quite close, then we'll all be able to hear what's going on. Thank you very much. Mr. James.
Seb.
You know, when you were in the court and you were helping people with the, who was your favorite client, which you helped in court?
Simon, could you hear that question?
Yes, I can. I'm trying to think about it. I think I can't really say that it's a really good question. I can't say who was my favorite client. What I was struck by is that as a defense barrister, there were so many people whose, even though they committed and often quite bad crimes, so many of the crimes had been committed in the heat of the moment, or because they'd become drunk, or because they'd gone in a wrong direction, and that the person that you saw now was different from that. And some of them, of course, were innocent as well. But so I had a great deal more empathy for them than I would now think I would, given that the sense is that they're all people are like on drugs and, you know, utterly violent and depraved. This wasn't my experience of the vast majority of my clients at all, that they were frightened, remorseful, and that they were in a situation where they really didn't understand what was going on. One of the more bizarre aspects of being a lawyer is that they are sitting behind you, really not understanding what's happening. And there's this process called the voir dire, where you try and get evidence excluded. And these cases and all this complex stuff going on, of which they have no clue about what is happening. And at the end of it, if you're successful, they walk out without understanding why. Sorry, probably not the best answer, but that has been my general impression.
Our next question.
Was Mr. Scott here when you were tour at the Dragon?
50 years? No. The one teacher who you would know who was still there was Mr. Peter Wilson. He was just begun when I was there. And
just on that, so you're
all the way on and just recently left. That's the only continuity, I think.
Yeah, the great PJ, who some of you will remember, used to be, as far as you're concerned, a lab tech here for many, many years. But prior to that, of course, he was lucky enough to be at the Dragon with Simon Tolkien, but he retired last year, PJ. But he's alive and well, he'd be glad to hear anyhow, Simon.
What's your favorite book?
Of other people's books? There's books like when I was a small boy, I was an only child, and I just read vociferously, and I think it's really helped my writing. I read Dickens, Trollope. I just loved books like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. This of going into these like country houses, this world. I loved Treasure Island. Later on, I loved the Gormenghast books by Mervyn Peake. And luckily, I liked The Lord of the Rings. My life would have been very difficult if I didn't.
Elsa.
When you worked in crime, what was the most dangerous situation you were in?
Well, it goes slightly back to the question that I was asked earlier about, you know, experience of clients. There were one or two who were crazy, and they hadn't been, you know, seen to be crazy. And suddenly you're in a room and you get that feeling, that kind of cold feeling that you're talking to them and they're not actually understanding because they're nuts, and that they could do something. And, you know, you're stuck in a legal visit in a room, and you've got to find a way to get yourself out of that room without provoking them. And if you bang on the door, God knows what they could do. So that sudden understanding that somebody who seemed all right isn't all right in the head was scary. But as I've described, some of the judges were very scary too. So I included that whole thing with Princess Diana and the flowers, a kind of illustration to that.
Room 6.
Did any or do any of your children write books?
My son, Nicholas, has written, is both a playwright and a poet. He wrote a play about Terezin, which was put on in New York. And Terezin was an interesting place because it was used by the Nazis as a kind of showcase to make everybody think that they were not actually exterminating the Jews, but keeping them in a kind of holiday camp situation. And it's about the people who worked there and what the experience, and it's about the commandant and what the experience of living that lie was really like. He also now writes poems, and he writes the most wonderful poetry. My daughter is much younger, and she's just coming to, she's studying English here, but she's going to be studying English at LMH for the next 6 months of next year, which I'm really excited about. Lady Margaret Hall, which is obviously next to you along the river. And part of what she's going to be studying is creative writing.
Bella.
What's your favorite book that your grandfather wrote?
Very much The Lord of the Rings. I never cease. I read it aloud to my son and to my daughter. I think that my grandfather and Robert Louis Stevenson are both extraordinary in terms of the quality of how they sound when you read them aloud. And I love The Lord of the Rings because it transports me to another world which exists, I think, in a three-dimensional, four-dimensional, if you like, way with its own history and world that is fully believable. And I don't think anybody else has been able to create that.
Does Bilbo defeat the Necromancer in the Rings?
No. Bilbo's experience is in The Hobbit, which is a book in which he goes on a journey with dwarves in order to find dragon gold, and comes back the richer for it, both in terms of his experience and in his pocket. But in the process, he goes under the Misty Mountains and meets a creature called Gollum, Sméagol, who has a ring. And when my grandfather wrote The Hobbit, it's quite interesting, in the 1930s, he had absolutely no idea that this was the ring. And it's only later when he came to write The Lord of the Rings that he found out that it was the ring. And he then had to go back to The Hobbit and change The Hobbit, because the game that Bilbo played under the Misty Mountains with Sméagol Gollum couldn't have worked as it was written in The Hobbit when Sméagol gave up the ring, because the power of the ring was such that nobody could voluntarily have given it up. So he rewrote that for The Hobbit, and there was a new edition after The Lord of the Rings was published.
Right.
When you were a lawyer, did you ever say the wrong thing? Like if they were guilty, did you accidentally?
Yes, this is difficult, and it's extremely important. And I think it became one of the things that was put into us from the very outset, is that everybody has the right to have the case against them proven. That means that they are not expected to make a defense. It's for the prosecution to prove the case. They can offer a defense. And so it becomes extremely important when you find somebody who's charged with a case, that you allow them to see the prosecution evidence and explain it to them so that they understand before you ask them whether they plead guilty. And I think mistakes, I tried never to make this mistake. Mistake can be made whereby the client bursts out with a plea when he shouldn't have done. So that does happen. I also, slightly in answer to your question, I have had those situations where you're standing up as a barrister in the middle of cross-examination and you lose your train of thought, which is a disaster. And there are ways to get over that, but that's not good.
Last question, Jesse.
What inspired you to become a barrister?
I tried to explain that when I was there, which is that it was luck. It was just simply because I went into the law because that seemed like a safe, good way, and my father was very much in favor of it. And then I qualified as a solicitor, and then I was doing these kind of things that I found boring, conveyancing and civil litigation. And then you had to study 3 areas of the law as an article clerk. And the last 6 months, I was sent up with this lady in the top of the offices, and I started doing crime. And suddenly it all became real to me. And it was kind of visceral. I felt, a strong draw to it. And that kind of took off for me. So it was funny that I went into something of the law thinking that I was making a sacrifice because I was doing something just playing safe. And it ended up as being a barrister, which was so stressful and exciting. And as I was saying, being your own director and actor.
Goodness. Simon, I don't know if you can see the hall very well, but we could be here all night answering questions from the next generations of
Thank you
dragons.
so much. That's kind.
And they're always good at asking questions. But if I may, Simon, just before we show our appreciation, I think your story and the humility in which you've shown and the perseverance as well in having different things going on in your life, too, some wonderful careers there. But thank you for sharing those with us and sharing with the next generation of dragons that you may not always know exactly what track you're going to be on, but if you stick with things, you can find your way through and you can make a wonderful life and a wonderful success of your life.
New horizons open. I agree.
Yeah, no, it's
Do
very
agree
kind
with
of you
that.
to do so. Simon, thank you very much also for shifting your time and sorting it all out and sorting out all the tech here
It's
so
an
that
honor.
you're able to be with us. And if I may, just before the dragons show their appreciation, when you are over visiting your daughter, I really do hope, which is later on this academic year, we hope, boys and girls, that Simon will be able to come and join us, and you might see him wandering around the playground, thinking about his marbles and talking about the old days. That's
Exactly.
how it was changed
love
that
that.
way. Thank you.
Good.
On that
Love
happy
that.
note, sir, we look forward to that. Boys and girls, can you just thank Mr. Tolkien again for his wonderful talk?
Thank you. Thank you. Come on.